Welcome back to the First Team College Football Show. I'm Joe DeLeone, joined by former NFL QB Matt Sims, as well as Irish Breakdown recruiting analyst Ryan Roberts. Today, we're going to talk mostly coaching as we're in the offseason, so we're not going to transition just yet to talking about the 2024 class that is going to be coming up very, very soon, though, folks. We decided today we're going to react to some news regarding the Georgia coaching staff, and then the other thing we're going to get to, we're going to do a few episodes. This is part one of giving out grades to guys that were first-year coaches last season for the 2022 year. And we're going to be breaking down things in terms of how they did in recruiting, how they did in terms of on-field success, all of that and more coming up on today's show. Guys, let's start off by talking about the current situation for the Georgia Bulldogs offensive coordinator. Now, Todd Monken, who I think a lot of people thought he was going to stay, he was going to stick around at Georgia, that he wasn't going to make that jump to the NFL, and instead he is going to be the Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator. Good for Lamar Jackson, I guess. Mike Bobo, who was an offensive analyst on the staff, is stepping in to replace him. Not much of a difference in continuity. Now, the main thing, taking the college football angle here, Matt, I want to kick it to you first. What do we think of this situation? Do we think that there is any cause for concern for Georgia that Mike Bobo is stepping in? Or should we be optimistic that things won't change and they'll be just as good as they were over the past few seasons under Monken?
I think we should expect the fact that, Mike Bobo has done a great job of just kind of building his career through longevity and being around a lot of really good coaches. Like we discussed last week when we were talking about the replacements of Nick Saban's assistants. At the end of the day, Kirby Smart is still at the helm of that ship, and Mike Bobo has done a phenomenal job in his role underneath Todd Monken, and he's adjusted his style from the last time that he was offensive coordinator with Coach Mark Richt and Matt Stafford at quarterback, and guys like Aaron Murray. So he's had tons of experience. He's been around a lot of good football players. He understands what the Georgia program needs and where it's going under Kirby Smart. And I think his experience with Todd Monken has, given an ability to understand the NFL thought process and how he can continue to apply that going forward when he is at the helm of that role.
Yep. Ryan, I know you're a big fan of offensive coordinator talk right now, but what are your thoughts on a situation that's not Notre Dame's?
Oh, Joe, I hate you. It's
all love here.
Yes, all love. I think that, there has to be an understanding that it doesn't have to look exactly the same, right? Because he's not inheriting a proven quarterback in Stetson Bennett. He's not inheriting, the wide receivers at a high level. He has to replace a couple of running backs this offseason as well. It's not one of those situations where it's just truly seamless. He's going to be breaking in a new quarterback, whether that is Gunnar Stockton or whether that is, Carson Beck or, whoever the quarterback ends up being for Georgia. I think that for me, though, I love that they went inside the program, though, because you do have things rolling, right? You've lost one football game in 2 years and you've won back-to-back national championships. I think that continuity is huge for this team. And I think that Mike Bobo has proven that he's a good OC. Things weren't great at Colorado State as the head coach, but for the most part, it hasn't been good at Colorado State under any head coach recently, right? So I think that it more is about the football mind. It's going to be a little bit of a different kind of intangible when you consider, Todd Monken was more of a wide receiver guy than he was a quarterback guy. Mike Bobo is a quarterback coach. He's a guy that kind of streamlines that. So I just think it might be more beneficial for some of the younger quarterbacks to have Mike Bobo that's more of a quarterback-proven guy, a guy that can kind of help tutel, give them the tutelage and help them get up to speed because they are going into a tough environment here. Have back-to-back national championship. That's a lot of pressure on these young quarterbacks to move in. So I think it's more about just that continuity. I think it's going to be big time for them. I don't think you should expect it to be quite as consistent or as explosive as it was under Todd Monken, because Todd Monken's one of the better offensive coordinators, on the NFL or college football level, which is why the Baltimore Ravens wanted him as their offensive coordinator. And I think that he was always more of an NFL coach than a college football coach, in my opinion. So I expect him to go back at some point. But I think that it's a good move. It's a standard move. Is it one move that I think is like, oh my God, like, oh, that's incredible? No, I wouldn't say that, but it's one of those. It's similar to what you thought about the defensive court, the Kevin Steele thing. This
Kevin
is what
Steele
I actually think. It's a good, solid move. Does it move the needle? Not necessarily, but it keeps the train rolling, which is what you need at Georgia.
Right. The way that I've kind of described it is it's a nothing hire. And I know that sounds as a negative connotation, but it's a negative in a good way, or it's a nothing in a good way. It's nothing because it's not going to completely derail things. You're probably going to be calling a very similar scheme. And this intention was to not have a complete diversion of what the previous offensive scheme was. And the big thing for me, Ryan, that you talked about here with Bobo is that he's got a history as a quarterback coach. And we look back to the last time where he previously was a quarterback at Georgia, and then his time as the offensive coordinator when he was at Georgia way back in the day, he was coaching Matthew Stafford and Aaron Murray. There were guys that he helped really blossom into really good quarterbacks. And I look at the guys that he's got on the roster with Brock Vandagriff and Carson Beck. Those are two highly recruited kids. This isn't a Stetson Bennett situation where he was a walk-on. He was a guy that had to work past the expectations and maybe had some physical limitations. Those two guys are really physically gifted, and I'd be optimistic that maybe not right away, but in the next couple of years that those young players that are going to be competing for the starting job, whoever it is, might step in and look really, really good. If not, maybe it's a future recruit. But that's the main takeaway here, guys, is that there's not going to be a significant drop-off. Maybe they go from being fifth last year, whatever they were, being in the top 5 to being in the top 15. This is a defensive-minded team. The priority is never always going to be offense. They're still going to be really freaking good. They're still going to be contending for a national championship.
Well, I mean, I don't know. They did average about 40 points a game, so clearly there is an emphasis on offensive play. But the thing for Bobo to keep in mind is to, now that he is back running an offense and his identity, is not to get caught up with all of the things that he learned over the years and just try to throw everything in there at once. He's got to really just make sure that he focuses on what his individual players do, the new players that are stepping up into big roles, maximizing those type of plays as many ways as you possibly can. As coaches would say, just dressing it up with different smoke and mirrors for different plays, but just stick to the basics, do the basics extremely well, and then continue to build off of that and finding your new identity as an offensive coordinator in this new generation.
I mean, if you're Mike Bobo, and to wrap this up, if you're Mike Bobo, how hard is it just to scheme Brock Bowers the football? That's all you got to do if you want to win football games, folks, is get Brock Bowers the football as often as possible. We'll see how this turns out, but I think we're all in agreement here that not a major negative impact to be transitioning to Mike Bobo for the offensive coordinator role.
And congratulations, Mike. According to Joe DeLeone, you were a nothing hire. So,
oh, come on. See, I will say that phrasing is the perfect phrasing to be completely pulled out of context.
Yes, like, it is. That's why I wanted to repeat it one more time.
There's probably a better word. Maybe solid hiring might be a better thing than saying, yeah, whatever. Yeah.
I'm trying to be creative here. Don't mind me. Okay, so guys, let's talk.
Yeah, it's okay.
Let's start off, though, the series that we're going to be doing for the next few weeks, which is looking at the premier coaching hires at big programs or just Power 5 programs in general and grading those first-year hires. And the guys that we're going to start off with today, we're going to try to get to all 4 of them. We'll see how many we get to in the 40 minutes on today's show. The ones that we did end up picking, Mario Cristobal, Brian Kelly, Dan Lanning, and Lincoln Riley, which are ultimately the biggest fish and the biggest programs amongst the first-year coaches. The 2022 cycle had a lot more major openings than this past one, so this is going to be a really interesting discussion to dive into. And I want to start us off with Mario Cristobal, who, frankly, amongst all 4 of these guys, had the least amount of on-field success. This past year, they went 5-7. They were 3-5 in the ACC. They were, frankly, a dumpster fire at times to watch on the field. But the main positive here is that they finished with the 6th best recruiting class overall in On3's recruiting rankings and finished in the top 10 on pretty much every single recruiting ranking out there. So there are positive steps going forward. And some of those key recruits that they did pull, Francis Magoa, an offensive tackle, five-star offensive tackle, Samson Okunlola, and then a 4-star edge, Jaden Wayne, who two of those guys we talked about and broke down on this show. Matt, I want to head over to you first here. If we're talking about Mario Cristobal, we're looking at the on-field success, the recruiting. How would we grade his first full season with recruiting and how things worked out on the field? How would you grade things for Mario Cristobal?
I think with just the finalization of this last recruiting step for his first year, I would give him a C+. And really, the main thing is I think recruiting is an A-. I think his on-the-field performance and just the way that he organized his staff this past year was really closer to, a C grade, C- grade. So I think the advantage here is that he cleaned up house a little bit, brought in a new defensive coordinator that's shown tremendous promise in what he has done at Marshall. Coach Lance Goodry, is that how you pronounce it, Ben? Goodry. And, he is someone that statistically had done some phenomenal things at Marshall with that defense. I think being a top 10 overall ranked defense nationally. And we saw that defense put on a show against Notre Dame early in the year against Tommy Rees in that offense. No offense, Ryan. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. But it is one of those things that he made adjustments where he need to. He brought in a good defensive coordinator that knows how to recruit extremely well. The biggest question mark, I think, really going for him now, right, to kind of encapsulate this offseason is to find a really good offensive coordinator that he can lean on and then start to build balance within his program and start to be a little bit more aggressive with recruiting, because it's very tough to recruit high-level quarterbacks and skill players when there's a big question mark on the offensive side of the football.
Well, I would say this, man. I actually give Mario Cristobal a lot of credit. He hit the eject button on both his coordinators after year one, which I think is a big step. I mean, Joe, I actually just watched the Miami versus Pitt coaches film 2 days ago. That Miami team was awful, man. There's not a lot of talent on that team. There's not. It wasn't. So 5-7 is not great. It is bad at Miami. It's not a good first season. It's not. There's no spin on that, right? But I do think that you look at it and say some coaches, though, look past things like that and say, it's okay, year two will be better. No, Mario Cristobal was like, no. There's some structural things that we need to do that need to be a lot better. So we're changing offensive coordinator, we're changing defense coordinator. And I think I think there's some self-evaluation thing to that, right? Like I applaud him for doing that because it's not an easy decision to make. So I think change can be good in that type of situation. My main thing is that, and I think me and Matt are on the same course here. I would have given it a C+ as well, because yes, 5-7 at Miami is not good enough and will never be good enough. There's no skating around that fact. But there also is some understanding that, like, hey, that wasn't a great roster you inherited. It wasn't a great roster. And you had to start building it up. And what did he do in year one? Despite going 5-7, he puts together a very good recruiting class, right? So I'm going to judge Mario Cristobal much more off of what does year two look like? What does year three look like? Because I think it's about growth for him. Because I do think that we need to understand that it wasn't a great roster. That offensive line was terrible. You lost your best offensive lineman in the beginning of the season, and that offensive line just went to shambles from there. Well, you got a couple 5-stars in the 2023 class, guys that could potentially play pretty early on. You need to figure out the offensive identity. You need to continue to build defense with guys like Jaden Wayne. I think year 2, year 3, year 4 are potentially going to be much better, obviously, and projecting in a much better direction for a Mario Cristobal. So I'm not going to completely hammer him because I don't think he inherited a great situation, a great roster.
Absolutely.
And he needs to keep building, and I think he can. So we'll see how it continues, obviously, into the 2023 season.
So the way that I'm looking at these grades is less about focusing as much, the main thing here is how they're setting themselves up for future success. So if we're talking about recruiting, we're giving this an A for the terrible roster that it was to finish 6th and then to pull all these really talented recruits that they got that we all spoke really highly of. It felt like it was one of those teams where every other week there was a top kid being brought up that was committed to the University of Miami, and they're getting back to getting all the kids from the state of Florida to go and play for their program. That is what they need to do for long-term success. To finish 5-7 and to still finish in the top 10 is an accomplishment. We knew that Mario Cristobal was a pretty good recruiter, but I got to be completely honest with you guys. The 5-7 record for me is an F. I give this a C minus. I don't know how that averages out, but I'm giving this overall a C minus. Yeah, I'm not good enough at math.
Don't worry.
But I'm giving this a C minus overall because
that also is not math because we're talking about letters.
Okay, wait. But the math is like a 73.
Just keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's okay. Carry the 7. Yeah. Whatever. Okay.
Yeah, like a 95 and a 50. Like, how do we average that out?
Right.
Forget that though. To finish 5-7 in the ACC and to lose to Middle Tennessee State is disturbingly terrible. It's just horrendously bad. And look, I got to be completely honest. I've heard from different people who had different destinations for Mario Cristobal that he's a little difficult to work with. And we saw last year when he was trying to hire coordinators, he had a lot of trouble finalizing those positions. He was one of the last guys to finalize those coordinator positions. And I know that he cleaned house and he's trying to make a transition here. And you talked about, Ryan, the importance of hitting the eject button. Part of me does think, is it because he's difficult to work with? And he still has to hire his offensive coordinator after some big names have been taken off the board. So I think this is, for me, in line with what you were talking about, Ryan, a remains to be seen situation. I need to see what he does next year on the field. And if things aren't trending in a very positive direction, I'm going to be wary before I can commit to saying that things are going to be successful for Mario Cristobal at Miami.
Well, I want to make one point about this topic too. I think a little bit of it is an identity issue with Miami as a whole and as a culture. You no longer, I think, have the ability to control the state of Florida. There's just too many competing schools that have a little bit more of a culture there. I mean, let's face it, Miami plays at the Dolphin Stadium. Everything is teal. There's nothing that says Hurricanes about it at all. And I think that's an issue. Like, there's a lack of identity. There's a lack of culture. It's a private school. It's a small school. And I think Miami has to almost take the national approach like a Notre Dame or like a USC going forward and recruiting people outside of the state of Florida a little bit more aggressively and landing the ones that you really care about in state. But to think that you were going to put a stranglehold on the state of Florida with all those other schools in the area, I think that's going to be very difficult for them going forward. So I think Mario has to be very conscious of that going forward, that the identity that Miami built itself upon no longer exists in this culture today. They need to reinvent themselves that way as far as recruiting and being a little bit more outside the lines of Florida. And the other aspect, again, it just goes to who is going to be the offensive coordinator for the Miami Hurricanes.
Right.
I think that is a huge piece. So right now it says Shannon Dawson, the offensive coordinator from Houston, is on the top of the list of people that he's looking at. That would be a really big hire, right? The question I think Shannon has is this a lateral move, or am I better at staying at Houston for another year and then getting another opportunity at a better school than a Miami?
Sure. And it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I would say this. The last time that Miami, because we remember well, maybe Joe doesn't remember because he's young as anything, but 2001 Miami, man. Like,
I'm like a couple years younger than you. Relax.
I remember 2001 Miami, right? And even though they lost to Ohio State that year in the Fiesta Bowl, that team was just an embarrassment of riches from a talent
as an NFL football team is what it was.
That was an NFL football team, Matt, but it also carried itself at a completely different level, right? The swagger of the U back then was just ridiculous. And kids still talk about it, right? Like, I talked to a lot of 2023 recruits that talked about, the U and stuff. But the last time the U was the U, those kids weren't alive. That's the point blank to it. It's like the Notre Dame thing, right? Last time Notre Dame won a national championship, these kids weren't alive. I mean, that's the point blank to it. So the brand still exists, but you need to get the brand back to being cool again. If you get Miami back to being cool again, then you're going to get great players and you're going to be attractive.
But even then, too, they played in the Orange Bowl. They had their own home. They had a little bit more of a vibe. There was just a little bit more of a vibe and a prestige to them that no longer – I mean, it's just very difficult to recreate that when you're traveling down to Hard Rock Stadium you know, and nothing is hurricane about it at all. And you can't even fill the bottom row of the stadium. Like, to me, that's very concerning when you're on a recruiting trip and there's 50 open seats in the section next to you. That's not very exciting to really think about as far as like, oh yeah, I want to go here and be a part of this because wow, look how special this is. You don't get that vibe at all.
Yeah, they really need to. They need an on-field or on-campus field. That's the only way that they're really, I think, can fill this, because there's a lot of pride for other programs that, you know, these kids can roll out of their frat houses and go into the stadium and just be excited to be at a football game. No one wants to get in a car and Uber, and also from what you kind of see is that it's impossible to get in and out of that stadium. So it sucks being a Miami football fan. Is Mario Cristobal the guy? It remains to be seen, and we're going to find out more in the future if things turn in the right direction. A guy, though, who in his first season did rapidly turn around a program in the first season was Brian Kelly from LSU. He left Notre Dame. He goes to LSU. In his first year, he goes 10-4, 6-2 in the SEC. He ends up finishing first in the West and lost in the SEC championship to the inevitable national championship winning Georgia Bulldogs with some key wins against teams like Alabama. Some other key recruits, though, finishing 5th in the On3 recruiting ranking. They got 5-star edge Deshaun Womack, 5-star offensive tackle Zalance Hurd, and then transfer corner Denver Harris from Texas A&M, as well as a 4-star wide receiver Shelton Sampson, who we spoke very highly on this show. Ryan, heading to you first because of our connections to Brian Kelly. What do we think here? How are we grading the first year for Brian Kelly overall?
I mean, he did a very good job in his first year at LSU. I mean, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to not give it an A or an A- from the full scope, because the one thing about Brian Kelly, and one thing that I was fully adamant about, Brian Kelly is a good football coach, right? And there's going to be a level of consistency that is going to be had at LSU because he did it at Notre Dame, right? He did it, and you showed that at Notre Dame, there was when he first took over, it was like, 7-8 wins was a good football season. But then by the end of it, it was like 10 wins. Anything less than 10 wins is a bad season, right? So I think he restored some consistency, or at least for expectation wise at LSU. I feel like I don't think that they're going to dip much further down than 10 wins in a football season while he's the head coach. I do think there's some questions of like just what the ceiling is ultimately with Brian Kelly, but consistency is not the worry for me, right? Like, I think that he is going to do the things from being a hard guy at the top, being a strict person that you have to abide by the standards of the program. And I think that he's put a really good amount of recruiters around him that the recruiting level is going to be good. I think that there's going to be a strict foundation to what the standards are at LSU. He did a good job, obviously beating a couple of really good football teams this past year, getting to the SEC championship game with a roster that did have a lot of turnover from the previous season before he took over this year. So I thought he did a really nice job assembling a staff, getting the players to buy into the expectations, especially after a not great start to the season. He got them to buy in, and he has a really good, a staff of recruiters around him. I think that there's going to be a conversation over, the thing that always held him back at Notre Dame was there was some stubbornness, from a staff perspective, but also, the development of the quarterback position. You have Jane Daniels now in year 2. You look at what Brian Kelly has done at Notre Dame with quarterbacks after a good first year, and the second year they seem to kind of regress a little bit. Can Jaden have another nice number 2? And then can you find whoever after Jaden? Is Ricky Collins the next guy? Like, who's the next guy to continue to build this program into the future? I think that those are the concerns, but just strictly off of the 2022 season, Brian Kelly did a very good job. I would give him an A. I thought he did really well on the, from an on-field perspective, and they recruited very well as a staff.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, Ryan, on this situation. I think his grade is definitely closer to an A- in this situation. And I think Brian Kelly really is the perfect guy for this program. I think LSU is one of those programs similar to a Georgia. There is a huge amount of talent in state. They don't have the issue of a Miami. They aren't competing against a lot of other really big schools and cultures and battling for the state lines. They own their states, LSU and Georgia. So if he continues to just draw that line around the state of Louisiana, own that, then hold the players accountable like a Dabo Swinney does, like a Kirby Smart does, like a Nick Saban does. I think their ability in state, year after year after year, and his ability to keep the culture sound and to be really tough, and honestly just an angry football team the way that they've always been at Notre Dame. Listen, Notre Dame was miserable. Their players were miserable. Their coaches were miserable, but they won. And there's something to be said about that. And you can say that same thing about Bill Belichick and all the other coaches that we just mentioned. There is somewhat of a miserable state of mind there in the facility constantly, and it's never good enough. I think this is the perfect mindset for a school like LSU to be constantly be in and not have a player's coach running that organization. I think they do need a tyrant, and I think that he is that tyrant that can continue to keep that standard alive. With his talent, that was always the question at Notre Dame. Not enough talent to get them over the hump. He got those teams into the playoff consideration multiple times year after year. I think he will continue to do that at LSU, and eventually he will do a good enough job in recruiting to have that one up on some of these other schools that have always been just slightly more talented than him in the past.
I'm willing to commit an A to this one. I agree with a lot of what you guys said here on Brian Kelly, and he steps into a situation where there's a lot of negative energy already directed towards him because of how bad the team was before, and then him leaving Notre Dame. And for the situation that LSU was in before he took the job, to the point where they were way under the number of scholarship players necessary to be competitive next year, for him to transition that effectively, to hop in the portal, get some good guys, to finish the way that they did and get a win over Alabama is huge to do in his first year. There's not a lot of LSU coaches that can say that they did that in their first year. One of their biggest rivals ends up pulling off that win. That, to me alone, to pull that off is fantastic for the future and the trajectory of this program. And the recruiting side of things, we talked about a lot of really good players throughout this cycle. When we were highlighting the 2023 group, they pulled a lot of really good recruits. And I think, and it shouldn't be too obnoxious and aggressive to say this, I think for the fact that they didn't really lose that many guys to the NFL draft, they didn't really lose many key important players to the transfer portal, there is no reason that they should not be the favorite in the West next season. They should be one of the most likely teams to win the West and be competing for a national championship. And I think one of the key factors here that should be talked about more when we try to project who's going to be playing in the college football playoff is returning a good quarterback who took strides towards the end of the season. And I completely agree with you, Ryan, is if Jaden Daniels doesn't take that step forward, then that won't be fulfilled. But if he can improve a little bit, work on some of those deficiencies, Jaden Daniels, I think stepping in as his second year as the starter for LSU, the ceiling should be very, very high for LSU.
Okay, that's enough Brian Kelly talk.
I want to already want to move on.
Trying to keep the time, man. You're supposed to be the producer, and you're running past time right now.
We're just kidding. We're doing fine on time. We're getting to 42.
I'm being a jerk. I'm just being a jerk. That's
Well,
all.
we'll move on to talking about Dan Lanning at Oregon. So we talked about Mario Cristobal, who is technically the counterpart here of Dan Lanning because he left Oregon. Dan Lanning steps in, who was the defensive coordinator at Georgia previously, and things already look really good for Oregon in their first year. They brought in Bo Nix, and Bo Nix played way better than I think many people expected. Kenny Dillingham ends up leaving to go to Arizona State. Nonetheless, they finished 10-3 this past year. There was a possibility that they could win the Pac-12, but just finished a little bit short. 7-2 in the Pac-12, fourth finish in the Pac-12 in a year where competition was at its highest with teams like UCLA, Washington, USC competing for the top. Now, in terms of recruiting, I think we can all agree there is not a program that didn't commit more highway robbery than Oregon with some of the guys that they stole on National Signing Day, some of the guys that they stole in the transfer portal, and some of those big names to recognize: 5-star wide receiver Jurian Dickey, 5-star edge Mateo Uyunglele, and then 4-star quarterback Austin Novosad amongst those key players. Matt, kicking it to you first here, talking about Dan Lanning. It was a really great first season. How would you grade things for him?
Definitely an A. That's an easy one. But also, like we discussed with Mario Cristobal, inherited, like you guys said, a fantastic situation, something that was already built. You know, this wasn't toothpicks and all that like the Miami situation. This was a solid foundation that he could then implement his own blueprint. I think Dan Lanning, his experience of being around guys like Nick Saban and Kirby Smart and being a part of multiple national championship caliber type of run teams has really given him the experience to take over a team like an Oregon and to infuse a little bit of that SEC attitude and mentality to the Pac-12 that I think, is kind of missing sometimes in that conference, right? A little bit more of an edge to their football teams instead of trying to be just high-powered offenses. He brings in a side of just toughness and attitude and playing really solid defense. And this is a guy that's been proven in a top-ranked defensive coordinator for multiple years, 3 years in a row at Georgia, where he was top 1 or 2 in all 3 years that he was there. So I think that mentality has really affected in an unbelievable way in that Oregon culture. And I expect big things again from Dan Lanning this year. And really the big question mark will be, Will Stein's adjustment as a first-time offensive coordinator, controlling everything. He was the co-offensive coordinator, pass game coordinator at Texas San Antonio, Yep. And now that he is the main guy replacing, a guy that did a phenomenal job with Bo Nix, that'll be the big question mark. How can he come in? How can he make his own imprint and his knowledge and his background? I believe in Will Stein for sure. I just do think that there'll be a small adjustment period being at the helm, by himself. Will Stein's a great dude, though. I was actually teammates with him in Louisville back in the day, and he is just an awesome guy, a hard worker, and I expect to him to continue his great young career in this coaching sphere. But it will definitely be an adjustment with him being the first-time play caller for the entire aspect of the offense.
I wasn't so I had some mixed feelings on Dan Lanning when he was originally brought into Oregon, just for the simple fact that. Yes, very good defensive minds, but he is under Kirby Smart. It's there is a little bit of a threshold there of even if you're not doing a great job, you still have Kirby ahead of you to help you out with some nuances of the game, right?
Of course.
He comes to Oregon. I thought he did a tremendous job in year one. I think that Kenny Dillingham was obviously a big portion of that success. The ability to get the most out of Bo Nix in year one, kind of what you talked about, Joe. I think that was an extraordinary coaching job. So it was a great hire. Obviously by Dan Lanning to get Kenny Dillingham. Now that he's at Arizona State, Matt already alluded to it, really do think Will Stein's the key, man, because you have a lot of good things happening offensively. Good running back, Bo Nix playing at a nice level, some talented receivers. There's a lot of good working at Oregon offensively. What does that transition period look like going from Kenny Dillingham to Will Stein? Can it be a little seamless? Is there too much of a transitional period? How long does that transitional period last? Those are some of the questions. I also believe that Will Stein is going to do a good job ultimately, though, because he is a smart guy. He did a tremendous job the past couple of years with the quarterback Harris over at UTSA and having the running game. And, they've done a lot of good things, obviously, at UTSA with Frank Harris over the last couple of years. So I think he's going to do a really nice job. What does that transitional period look like? And how quickly can you get now some of these top-ranked recruits ready to play? Because that was the one thing about that defense last year was defense was good, but it wasn't a great defense because you still need to restock the cupboard a little bit. Getting guys like Mateo Uyunglele to come in. Can he come in and give you some instant impact? Because your pass rush needs to be a little bit better. Your pass defense needs to be a little bit better. So I think he's got everything working. I give him a very solid A grade in the first year. I thought he did a better job than I initially anticipated that he would in year one. I think he has a nice little atmosphere over there right now as far as what the expectations are now already at Oregon. So he inherited a good situation. I think he's making it better. It's just about what that transitional period is offensively and how quickly you can get some of those defensive studs ready to play in year one.
One of the bright points, too, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Joe. I just want to make this one point. Will Stein's adjustment, he did a great job, right, as you said, with Harris and having a number 9 nationally ranked offense at Texas San Antonio. One of the things that I think is most important going forward is the fact that they were a top 25 rushing offense while he was there. And that'll be something that I think just for the identity of Coach Lanning, right, and Will Stein and a Bo Nix, is being able to implement the run game that effectively in his first year as well. We know that Bo Nix and his talent and his ability to get better as a passer this past year, but they definitely have to continue to work on being a balanced offense and controlling the clock and the management of the game, especially when you start to play against some of these high caliber offenses. You saw it with the USC Tulane game. Caleb Williams did a great job of just throwing all over the field, but at the end of the day, couldn't manage and control the clock enough to win the football game. So that's something that teams in the Pac-12 I think need to focus on, especially Oregon and Bo Nix and Will Stein going forward this year.
Yeah, I think that Will Stein pickup is really sneaky good. If only Notre Dame could hire a guy like that. But besides the point, for me, and I agree with a lot of the stuff that you said early on, Matt, I'm giving this a B plus. And I know that some people might think, like, how do you not give it an A? It's a great first season.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, the one thing you said early on that's really important here is that Mario Cristobal had already built this roster, and not a lot of guys really left for the NFL. That offensive line was already built. A lot of key defensive players were already still there. This was a team that already had some 5-star guys on it. Like, this was a good roster. And for the success that they had in their first year for anytime first-year head coach was fantastic. But the only reason why I'm giving him a slight knock is that I need to see what he does in his second year, his third year, when he's the one who's building and cultivating this roster. The other thing as well, the recruiting's been fantastic. The recruiting polls that they have had and the guys that they got this past cycle, they blew everybody out of the water. I don't think anyone expected Oregon to do this well in recruiting in Dan Lanning's first year. So they're progressing in the right direction, and there's a lot of really positive things that are happening in Eugene, Oregon.
Shout out to Phil Knight.
Shout out to Phil Knight. The money talks, man. Money talks. Let's get to talking about our last guy here who transitioned as well from a bigger program to another major brand, Lincoln Riley, who is now the head coach at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He finished last year with a 11-3 record, 8-1 in the Pac-12. They lost their bowl game against Tulane, which is a little bit of an underwhelming situation, and their 2 losses came against Utah this past year. One of the other things to note, Caleb Williams finishes as the winner for the Heisman. And then in terms of recruiting, we were a little bit up and down on their performance in general as they finished 13th in the On3 recruiting rankings. 5-star wide receiver Zachariah Branch is one of the big name pulls that they got, as well as 5-star quarterback Malachi Nelson. And then they also managed to pull transfer Anthony Lucas, defensive lineman from Texas A&M. Now, with all of that, with the mess that USC was, Matt, I want to go to you first here to wrap us up. What do you think? How would you grade things for Lincoln Riley?
I think he did a great job. I mean, the biggest thing that he really took away, right, when he left Oklahoma is Caleb Williams. The question mark is that after Caleb is gone after this year, what are you going to do next at the quarterback position? Now, Malachi Nelson, that is an awesome pick and an awesome pickup for his program, stealing him away from Oregon, which is unbelievable here in the 11th hour of the recruiting process. For Lincoln, we know his prowess as an offensive mind, as an offensive coach. The big question mark really will just be, can you continue to recruit aggressively nationally, like I mentioned for Mario Cristobal, and really try to just get deep-rooted across the country as much as possible and to really develop more players in your program going forward. I don't think they're going to be a team that can really get guys that are just for sure, dominant day one players year in and year out, at least not yet. I think right now the foundation will have to be built more on a developmental procedure going forward. So biggest question mark really is consistency on the recruiting level. Consistency as far as improving defensively is the big question mark going forward. Have to play better defense, more consistent defense, affecting the opposing team quarterback more consistently than what they did the last year. We know they're going to score points, but like we mentioned with Dan Lanning, need to develop a little bit more of a physical attitude to compete for that national championship type of level football. Because we saw what Utah did to them. Utah really did just kind of like smack them around a little bit physically. I think they had a little bit more of an attitude, a little bit more of an edge to them. So that's something that USC has to find a way to tap into more going forward with their players and with their coaching staff.
I have no worries about Lincoln Riley as an offensive coach. He can coach the quarterback position. He likes to run the football, surprisingly, which as an air raid guy is pretty rare. Like, you don't see a bunch of those guys that like to actually establish the line of scrimmage a little bit at times. So I think offensively, USC's in a great spot, right? You have Caleb Williams. You're going to attract guys like Malachi Nelson pretty consistently. You're going to attract wide receivers. You got Jordan Addison as a transfer last year. You got Zachariah Branch, who's one of the better just overall players in the 2023 recruiting class. You're going to attract those offensive players. There's no doubt about it. You hit on it, though, Matt. defensively is the question that is always going to be there, because we've talked about the Alex Grinch thing for a long time, right? We've talked about his inability to maybe, kind of develop and consistently be a gap sound defense. And no matter how much we like it, how much we dislike it, that's who Lincoln Riley trusts. Going back to Oklahoma, now into USC, he trusts Alex Grinch to run his defense. So that thing's not going to change here, I don't think. Right. So the question is, can you get enough defensive talent? They got Anthony Lucas in the portal. That's awesome. But are they going to be able to use him properly? Are they going to be able to get the most out of him? Defensively is where it's going to be the biggest question mark for me. I think they're going to recruit offense at a high level. I think they're going to develop offense at a high level. I give it a B+ because on the field was tremendous. It was. Taking a 4-8 football team and getting into 10 wins in your first season, even with the overhaul, fantastic job, in my opinion, by Lincoln Riley. But moving forward, projecting forward, are you going to be able to take it to the next level? Are you going to be able to contend for championships? Is defense going to be quite good enough? Is defensive recruiting going to be quite good enough? Those are the question marks I have.
And that for me is why, and look, I'm a known USC hater. USC fans can't stand me from some of the things I've said on the show. I give this a B, and I actually push back a little bit. I think the on-field results were great against crappy teams. When they played Utah both times, they lost in the Pac-12 championship game.
Well, they went 4-8 against that same crappy schedule, though, the year before. So,
well, that's true. That's
they
did
increase by 6 wins in 1 year. I mean,
yeah, that is true. That's why I'm giving it a B. I'm giving him credit for the rapid increase in performance. But to lose to Tulane in your bowl game is pretty freaking embarrassing. And then I think where the biggest head scratcher is, why the hell did you keep Alex Grinch after all the things that you saw this past year? That, to me, I think is going to really hold down Lincoln Riley. If they do not step up defensively and it's more of the same, they're not going to win the Pac-12. Plain and simple. Guys, we got to get out of here, though. The show is wrapping up now. At Joe DeLeone, at Sims Complete QB, at Rise and Draft on Twitter. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, as always, on Stadium, or if you're listening in on YouTube or on wherever you catch your podcasts. We'll be back with more next week. Enjoy the rest of your week, folks.